Ron Howard's life story is often presented as one of Hollywood's rare success narratives, a child star who avoided scandal, transitioned smoothly into adulthood, and ultimately became an Oscar-winning director. Yet when headlines suggest that the tragedy of Ron Howard is beyond heartbreaking, they are not pointing to a dramatic downfall, but to something far quieter and more complex: the emotional cost of a life shaped too early by fame, discipline, and expectations. Ron Howard entered the entertainment industry at an age when most children are still discovering who they are. As Opie Taylor on The Andy Griffith Show, he became a familiar face in millions of American homes before he was old enough to understand what fame truly meant. Later, his role on Happy Days reinforced his image as the embodiment of wholesome, dependable American youth. From the outside, this appeared ideal: loving parents, stable work, and none of the chaos that plagued many child actors of his generation. However, this apparent stability came at a significant price. Growing up in front of cameras meant that Howard's identity was never entirely his own. His value, from a very young age, was linked to performance, professionalism, and public approval. While other children learned through mistakes and emotional messiness, Howard learned restraint, discipline, and control. These traits protected Chaim from self-destruction, but they also denied him the freedom to be careless, rebellious, or simply ordinary. In later reflections, Howard has acknowledged that his childhood lacked spontaneity. Every decision, education, friendships, behavior was filtered through the lens of career preservation. This is not a dramatic tragedy in the conventional sense, but it is a profound one: the quiet loss of a carefree youth. The emotional development that normally unfolds without pressure was instead managed carefully, almost strategically. Success demanded maturity long before it should have been required. What makes this aspect of Howard's life particularly heartbreaking is that it is so easily overlooked because he did not implode like so many child stars. His experience is often treated as evidence that early fame can be harmless if handled correctly. This interpretation ignores a subtler truth: survival is not the same as freedom. Avoiding visible damage does not mean escaping emotional cost. Moreover, early fame placed Howard on a narrow path. The industry and the public formed expectations about who he was supposed to be. Deviating from that image carried risks, not only professionally, but psychologically, to remain employable and respected. He learned to suppress uncertainty and vulnerability over time. This self-regulation became part of his identity. Thus, the first layer of Ron Howard's so-called tragedy lies not in what went wrong, but in what was quietly sacrificed. His story challenges the assumption that a smooth trajectory equals a painless one. It reveals how success, when achieved too early, can subtly redefine a life before the individual has had the chance to choose who they want to become. If Ron Howard's childhood illustrates the hidden cost of early success, his adult career reveals a different but equally complex struggle: the burden of reinvention and the persistent need to prove legitimacy. Transitioning from beloved child actor to respected filmmaker is notoriously difficult, and although Howard achieved what few others ever have, the path was far from effortless or emotionally neutral. When Howard stepped behind the camera, he did so with an acute awareness of how he was perceived. To many in Hollywood, he was not an emerging auteur, but Opie, a former television actor attempting to reinvent himself. This perception followed him well into his directing career. Early films such as Night Shift and Splash demonstrated competence and commercial appeal, yet they also reinforced a label that would cling to Chaim for decades: reliable, mainstream, and safe. The term safe may sound flattering in an industry driven by risk, but it carries a quiet sting. It implies a lack of artistic daring, an absence of personal voice, and a preference for structure over experimentation. Howard's films were often praised for their craftsmanship and narrative clarity, but rarely for radical vision. Even after Apollo 13 established him as a master of tension and a beautiful mind earned him an Academy Award, the narrative persisted that his success was built on execution rather than artistry. This framing created a paradox. Howard was undeniably successful, yet success itself became a limitation. Each new project was judged against the expectation that he would deliver competence, not surprise. Innovation carried greater risk for him than for directors already branded as auteurs. In this sense, Howard was confined by his own reliability, locked into a professional identity that left little room for visible struggle or reinvention. Emotionally, this dynamic can be deeply isolating. Artists often rely on recognition not only for their work, but for the intention behind it. For Howard, intention was frequently overlooked. His discipline, precision, and narrative restraint were treated as default qualities rather than deliberate choices. The result was a career defined by consistency, but shadowed by a lack of emotional acknowledgement for the effort required to maintain it. Compounding this was Howard's temperament. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he did not cultivate a public persona of rebellion or eccentricity. He avoided controversy, spoke carefully, and rarely expressed bitterness. While this protected his reputation, it also reinforced the idea that he was untouched by doubt or frustration. In reality, maintaining such composure over decades demands continuous emotional regulation. The tragedy suggested in discussions of Ron Howard at this stage of his life lies in this long-term compression of self. Reinvention, for Chaim, did not involve loud transformation, but incremental shifts under constant scrutiny. Each achievement raised the bar, not for admiration, but for expectation. Failure was not an option, and emotional fatigue was not a narrative the public was prepared to accept. Ultimately, Howard's struggle for recognition was never about awards or box office success. It was about being seen as more than a competent professional, about having his creative identity understood on its own terms. His story exposes a rarely discussed cost of sustained success. When excellence becomes assumed, the human effort behind it quietly disappears from view. In the later stages of Ron Howard's life and career, the conversation inevitably shifts from achievement to legacy. At this point, he no longer has anything left to prove in conventional terms. His resume spans decades, genres, and generations, marked by commercial success, critical recognition, and institutional respect. Yet longevity itself carries a distinct emotional weight, one that is often misunderstood or ignored. For artists who endure as long as Howard has, Timmy becomes both an ally and a burden. With each passing year, the industry's expectations subtly change. New voices emerge, styles evolve, and cultural priorities shift. While some veterans struggle visibly against irrelevance, Howard has remained active and employable. However, continued relevance often requires adaptation, and adaptation demands restraint. The challenge is not staying visible, but staying authentic without disrupting the identity others have already assigned. As Howard entered his later years, his work increasingly reflected themes of responsibility, consequence, and human limitation. These were not radical departures, but refinements evidence of an artist looking inward rather than outward. Yet such evolution rarely attracts attention in a media environment that favors dramatic reinvention or decline. Quiet maturity does not generate headlines, even when it reflects deep personal reckoning. Legacy, in this context, becomes a double-edged concept. On one hand, Howard is frequently cited as a model of professionalism and stability. On the other, this framing risks flattening his humanity. He is remembered as someone who did everything right, a phrase that sounds like praise but leaves little room for emotional complexity. It implies a life without fracture, when in reality, endurance itself often requires the suppression of personal cost. Another dimension of late-career reflection involves comparison. Howard belongs to a generation that includes highly mythologized directors whose struggles, excesses, and conflicts are celebrated as evidence of artistic depth. Against this backdrop, Howard's steadiness can appear unremarkable, even though it may have required greater self-denial. His story raises an uncomfortable question. Why is suffering only valued when it is visible or destructive? The emotional gravity of Howard's later years lies in recognition deferred, not recognition for success, which he has received in abundance, but recognition for resilience. Resilience is rarely romanticized. It lacks the drama of collapse and the glamour of rebellion. Yet, sustaining clarity, discipline, and purpose over half a century in an unforgiving industry is a formidable achievement, one that extracts its own psychological toll. As he reflects on his career, Howard stands not as a tragic figure in the traditional sense, but as a quietly instructive one. His life demonstrates that tragedy can exist without spectacle, that sacrifice can occur without public loss, and that emotional endurance can be as demanding as any visible crisis. In the end, the true weight of Ron Howard's story is not found in a single heartbreaking event, but in a lifetime of balance between ambition and restraint, visibility and privacy, success and self-containment. His legacy challenges us to reconsider how we define tragedy, and to acknowledge the unseen costs of a life spent continually meeting expectations without ever being allowed to fall. By the time Ron Howard reaches his 70s, the idea of tragedy attached to his name demands redefinition. Traditional narratives of tragedy rely on collapse scandal, addiction, public failure, or early death. Howard's life contains none of these elements. Instead, his story forces a more uncomfortable examination of tragedy as something cumulative, internal, and largely invisible. It is not the story of what was lost suddenly, but of what was surrendered gradually. Howard's career represents a sustained exercise in emotional regulation. From childhood onward, he learned that stability was both a shield and a requirement. This discipline protected Chaim from many of the destructive paths that claimed his peers. Yet, it also shaped his inner life in ways that were rarely questioned. Over time, restraint became second nature. The danger of such long-term self-management is not emotional collapse, but emotional narrowing, the quiet reduction of the range of feelings one allows oneself to publicly express. In this light, Howard's tragedy is not that he suffered greatly, but that he was rarely permitted to suffer openly. Public sympathy tends to gravitate toward visible pain. Howard, by contrast, embodied control. As a result, his internal struggles, doubt, fatigue, creative insecurity, were absorbed privately rather than acknowledged collectively. This absence of shared recognition can be profoundly isolating, especially over decades. Another defining aspect of Howard's story is the moral expectation placed upon Chaim. He became a symbol of how to do fame correctly. This symbolic role carried an ethical weight. He was expected to be an example, not merely an artist. Deviating from that role would have felt like a betrayal, not only of the public, but of the narrative that had grown around Chaim. In effect, he was confined by his own success, responsible for maintaining an image that left little room for emotional deviation. This raises a broader cultural question. Do we only recognize tragedy when it looks chaotic? Howard's life suggests otherwise. His experience illustrates how society often overlooks the emotional cost of being consistently reliable, agreeable, and composed. In professional environments, these traits are rewarded, but the long-term psychological toll is rarely discussed. The tragedy lies not in exploitation, but in normalization, the way continuous self-suppression becomes invisible because it functions so well. Importantly, this interpretation does not frame Howard as a victim. He exercised agency, made conscious choices, and benefited greatly from them. Yet agency does not eliminate cost. Choosing discipline over expression, longevity over risk, and balance over excess involves trade-offs that only become fully visible in retrospect. Howard's reflections in later years suggest an awareness of these compromises, even if they are expressed with characteristic restraint. Ultimately, Ron Howard's life invites a more nuanced understanding of human experience. It challenges the assumption that happiness is guaranteed by success, or that tragedy requires disaster. His story teaches that a life can be exemplary and still emotionally demanding, fulfilling and still marked by quiet loss. In redefining tragedy through Howard's lens, we are encouraged to look beyond spectacle and ask deeper questions about what it means to live well, endure responsibly, and carry expectations without ever laying them down. As the narrative of Ron Howard's life approaches its final chapters, the focus naturally shifts from interpretation to residue. What remains after decades of work, discipline, and public approval? When the applause fades and professional obligations slow, an enduring question emerges. What is left for someone whose identity has long been intertwined with consistency, responsibility, and success? For much of his life, Howard existed in a forward-facing mode. There was always a next project, a next responsibility, a next expectation to meet. This constant momentum provided structure and purpose, but it also postponed stillness. In later years, as the pace inevitably changes, stillness becomes unavoidable. It is in this space that unaddressed emotional weight often surfaces, not dramatically, but reflectively. The unspoken legacy of Howard's career lies in what he normalized. He demonstrated that longevity without self-destruction is possible, that professionalism can coexist with creativity, and that ambition does not require chaos. Yet by embodying this model so completely, he also absorbed its limitations. When restraint becomes habitual, expressing need can feel unnecessary or even inappropriate. Over time, the habit of self-containment risks outliving its usefulness. Another residue of such a life is the asymmetry between public gratitude and private experience. Howard is widely respected, yet respect is not intimacy. Audiences celebrate outcomes, films completed, awards earned, careers sustained, without fully engaging with the personal cost of producing them. The emotional labor behind reliability is rarely acknowledged because it does not disrupt the system. It supports it. In this sense, Howard's legacy is both instructive and cautionary. It instructs by proving that balance and endurance are achievable. It cautions by reminding us that endurance alone does not guarantee emotional fulfillment. A life spent meeting expectations can leave little room to examine whether those expectations were ever renegotiated, or simply inherited and maintained. There is also a generational dimension to Howard's story. He belongs to an era that valued composure, loyalty, and emotional privacy, particularly for men. Vulnerability was not currency. Competence was. As cultural attitudes evolve, younger generations are more willing to articulate struggle openly. Howard's silence, then, is not merely personal but cultural, a reflection of the norms that shaped him. What ultimately remains after the applause is not tragedy, but complexity. Howard's life resists simple moral conclusions. It is neither a cautionary tale nor an ideal blueprint. Instead, it offers a nuanced portrait of success lived responsibly, and the subtle costs that accompany such a life. In the final accounting, Ron Howard's story asks us to reconsider how we measure a life well lived. Is it by consistency, impact, and respect, or by emotional freedom, self-expression, and inner ease? His legacy suggests that these measures are not always aligned. What remains, then, is a quiet truth. A person can give the world stability, clarity, and decades of meaningful work, and still carry questions that no achievement fully answers. That unresolved space calm, dignified, and deeply human may be the most enduring part of Ron Howard's story. In considering the final dimension of Ron Howard's life and career, it becomes clear that his story does not move toward catharsis in the traditional sense. There is no moment of dramatic confession, no public reckoning, no late-life reinvention that reframes everything that came before. Instead, Howard's narrative settles into something quieter and more realistic: closure without release, understanding without emotional excess. For individuals who have spent a lifetime maintaining balance and control, resolution rarely arrives as a single event. It emerges gradually, through reflection rather than revelation. Howard's later interviews and public appearances suggest a man at peace with his choices, yet not unaware of their cost. Acceptance, in this context, does not imply that every question has been answered, only that the remaining questions have been integrated into a coherent sense of self. This form of closure can be deeply unsatisfying to an audience accustomed to dramatic arcs. We expect stories to end with transformation or redemption. Howard offers neither. His life demonstrates that some paths are defined not by turning points, but by continuity. The emotional work lies not in changing direction, but in learning how to live meaningfully within the direction already chosen. One of the most striking aspects of Howard's story is his comfort with ambiguity. He does not attempt to retroactively justify every sacrifice or frame every compromise as destiny. Instead, there is an implicit acknowledgement that trade-offs are inseparable from long-term commitment. This maturity stands in contrast to cultural narratives that demand clarity and closure, often at the expense of honesty. The absence of catharsis also reflects a deeper truth about endurance. People who persist through decades of responsibility often do not experience release because release was never the goal. Stability was. The skills that allowed Howard to thrive: emotional moderation, self-discipline, strategic restraint, are not easily set aside. Even when external pressure diminishes, they become part of the internal architecture of the self. As a result, the end of public obligation does not automatically produce emotional liberation. Instead, it offers space for quiet recalibration. For Howard, this recalibration appears to involve mentorship, selective creative engagement, and reflection rather than reinvention. These choices suggest a desire not to escape his past, but to contextualize it. Ultimately, Part 6 underscores a sobering insight. Not all meaningful lives culminate in emotional resolution. Some culminate in clarity without comfort, understanding without absolution. Howard's life exemplifies this reality. His achievements stand complete, yet they do not erase the complexity of the path that produced them. In this sense, Ron Howard's story is deeply human. It acknowledges that a life can be well-lived, ethically grounded, and socially admired, while still containing unanswered questions. Closure, for Chaim, is not the absence of doubt, but the ability to coexist with it. That quiet coexistence, measured, reflective, and unresolved, may be the most honest ending available. As this examination reaches its final stage, the most challenging aspect of Ron Howard's story becomes clear. It resists the very structure through which modern culture understands meaning. We are conditioned to recognize significance through rupture, failure, scandal, redemption, or reinvention. Howard's life contains none of these narrative markers, and that absence, paradoxically, is what makes his story so difficult to interpret and, in some ways, so quietly heavy. A life without collapse does not invite easy empathy. There is no single moment that demands forgiveness or celebration. Instead, there is continuity, steady effort, consistent judgment, and long-term responsibility. Howard's career unfolded as a series of careful decisions, each one reducing risk while increasing expectation. Over time, this produced not dramatic tension, but accumulated weight. What often goes unrecognized is that collapse, while destructive, offers release. It creates a before and after. Howard's life offers no such division. He never fell apart, and therefore never had the opportunity to rebuild himself publicly. This meant that growth occurred internally, without ceremony or validation. The labor of becoming was continuous and largely invisible. In a cultural environment that romanticizes extremes, moderation is easily mistaken for ease. Howard's emotional steadiness has frequently been interpreted as a lack of depth rather than a sign of sustained self-regulation. Yet, self-regulation, practiced over decades, can be as taxing as any visible crisis. It requires constant calibration of ambition, ego, relationships, and self-expectation. Another reason Howard's story is difficult to tell is that it complicates moral clarity. There is no antagonist, no industry villain, no personal demon to overcome. The pressure he navigated was systemic and diffuse. The weight of public expectation, the inertia of early identity, and the silent demand to remain dependable. These forces are harder to dramatize because they implicate everyone and no one at once. Howard's experience also exposes a gap in how success is emotionally processed. Achievement is often treated as a conclusion rather than a condition. Once success is achieved, the internal experience of maintaining it is rarely examined. For Howard, success was not an endpoint, but a permanent environment. Living inside that environment required continuous adaptation, restraint, and emotional containment. In the end, the tragedy associated with Ron Howard is not sorrow, but invisibility. Not the invisibility of failure, but of effort. His story invites recognition of a form of human labor that rarely receives narrative attention: the labor of staying intact. This does not diminish his accomplishments, it reframes them. It suggests that the cost of a life without collapse is not drama, but endurance. And endurance, when sustained long enough, becomes its own quiet burden. Ron Howard's life reminds us that not all meaningful stories break. Some hold. And sometimes, holding together requires more from a person than falling apart ever would.